let's talk Warframe. I'm slowly working on a bigger Warframe video in the background, but until then, I wanted to release some smaller videos about this game in the meantime. If you go back earlier in my channel, you'll see that one of the first videos I uploaded was about Warframe, a small objection.lol skit talking about how Octavia's kit works and meshes together. Consider this the HD remaster, now that I actually have a machine that can run it and record it at a decent quality, and now that I know how editing works. Octavia is a music-themed support frame. She specializes in crowd aggro and AoE damage, with minor ally buffs sprinkled in. She does have some small flaws that hold her back from being my favorite as of late, but I still like to use her every so often. As a note, if I ever get stat numbers for abilities, it assumes max rank with no mods. As far as raw stats, Octavia is pretty average, if a little on the squishier side. She has an above average energy pool, and her sprint speed is, once again, average. Octavia's defining feature is the mandachord. This thing is a small MIDI sequencer with slots for percussion, bass, and melody. The notes placed on the mandachord determine how some of her abilities work, but we'll get to how when we discuss each ability. First, let's talk about her passive, Inspiration. Whenever Octavia casts an ability, she and allies within 15 meters of her get 1 energy per second for 30 seconds. We have concluded talking about Inspiration. To be real for a second, this passive is just okay. The fact that it isn't affected by ability mods really holds it back in my opinion, but it's better to have it than to not. Octavia's first ability is the Mallet. You throw out a small orb that damages enemies within range. The frequency of damage depends on your percussion track, and if an enemy attacks the orb, the amount of damage increases, specifically dealing 2.5 times the amount of damage it's received in its lifetime. Nothing too crazy. Its biggest problem is that it doesn't have any targeting priority internally, which can lead to you still being shot over the mallet. Her second ability is the Resonator. You throw out a roller ball that charms and pacifies enemies within its range. Said radius starts small, but slowly grows to be bigger than the mallets as it charms more enemies. It'll also automatically move towards enemies that it hasn't charmed yet. This one plays your bass track, and it does a small amount of blast damage for each note. It'll stagger enemies when it expires. So far, we have a stationary ability that has short range and can potentially deal tons of damage, and an ability with decent range that moves around and pacifies enemies, but deals low damage. If only there was a way we could have the best of both worlds. Oh. Yes, folks, this is Octavia's bread and butter. The Mallet and Resonator can combine. They will now seek enemies automatically. The Resonator's pacifying ability is disabled, and enemies are now actively enticed to shoot the Mallet. In Star Chart, this is enough to nuke a lot of rooms on its own, especially with duration mods. Look at they go. Octavia's third ability, Metronome, is fairly complicated, and how good it is mainly depends on your playstyle. It starts playing your melody track, and performing actions in time with the melody gives you various buffs. Allies can also benefit from these buffs if they perform the action. Jumping gives you a 30% movement buff. Crouching makes you invisible. Shooting a weapon gives you 30% multi-shot. And swinging your melee weapon gives you a 30% damage buff. It's probably somewhat worth noting that these buffs stack additively with mods. I'll link a video by the Kengineer in the description for the full deep dive as to why that's relevant, but to keep it short, it doesn't really scale well, especially since it's a pretty small buff comparatively. Her fourth ability is the Amp. The floor around you becomes a dance floor, and allies within radius gain a damage buff based on the sound level in the area. It also doubles the range and damage output of any mallets. This ability is pretty decent, especially in stationary missions like defense or interception. The max boost scales really well with strength mods, and doubling the mallet range and damage can really melt enemy health bars in rooms. I guess I should mention Augment mods as well, since they'll become relevant in other videos I want to make. Augment mods add to certain abilities on your Warframe. For example, Octavia has the Partition Mallet and Conductor augments. Partition Mallet lets you have 2 mallets out on the field at the same time, with the caveat that they both have 80% of the normal range assuming max rank. The 2 mallets cannot be placed within each other's ranges, and the Resonator can only carry one at a time. Both can affect enemies, however. Conductor changes your Resonator's behavior. You can recast the ability while it's active to have it move to where you're pointing. It'll stay there for the rest of the duration. You can also hold the ability button down to let it roam free again. Alright, we've explained the abilities, now we get into the opinions part. My completely biased and super controversial opinion is... she's fine. She's just fine, but she's fine. The biggest problem with Octavia, in my opinion, is that she's just kinda boring. Either you're doing most of the work with your weapons, or you're sitting there so you can let the mallet build up damage. Being squishy doesn't really help either. I do have to give her some credit. She really carried me through Star Chart and for a few hundred hours, and even helped me get through the first few planets of Steel Path. Casting Mallet, Resonator, Metronome, and just spamming crouch and watching enemies drop around me was and still is pretty fun sometimes. Again, not to say she's a bad Warframe or anything, like that even really exists in this game. Don't let the opinion of one guy on the internet stop you from enjoying what you like. She's a very decent mid-game pick, and I'd still very much recommend having her in your arsenal.